Welcome back to the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. And as journalists, we're fierce defenders of democracy. And that's one reason we love the Detroit Documenters. They train and pay residents to attend and cover local government meetings in Southeast Michigan, making public information more accessible. The Documenters have spent 7 years nurturing local journalism and fostering community-driven reporting. Their work amplifies voices that are often go unheard, and they help us to hold our local leaders accountable.
We love all of that, Tia. And today, the Documenters have their eyes on Highland Park. The once thriving city bordering Detroit faces major challenges today, and Highland Park's decline is in sharp contrast to Detroit's revival. So the Documenters have been attending Highland Park City Council meetings to understand exactly what kinds of challenges local leaders are prioritizing. Metro producer Jack Filbrandt sat down with Detroit Documenters coordinator Noah Kincade and documenter Sherrie Smith to learn more.
We're looking at Highland Park and paying attention specifically to their city council because the story of Highland Park is very much the story of Detroit. They are obviously like a microcosm of Detroit. And we're also kind of watching their story develop maybe 10, 12, 15 years, a little bit later than Detroit's. Both cities are majority black cities. Both have history that is deeply intertwined with the auto industry. Both cities faced decades and decades of disinvestment due to, redlining and systemic racism and all kinds of issues, economic, socioeconomic. Because of that disinvestment, they've lost a lot of their population from where they were when they were initially kind of built and at their height, which means that they have a low tax base. They have fewer people per square mile, and so less taxpayers, less revenue coming in to support the infrastructure across their city. They both have high levels of poverty. Actually, Highland Park has even a worse situation with poverty, with around 41% of their population facing poverty versus about 31% in Detroit. And so they have all these similarities, and Detroit, though, we're very happy to see is kind of like emerged from the fire, whereas Highland Park is still being forged in it, right? They're still being tested right now, and we actually don't know. It's not certain whether they're going to emerge on the other side. And so, we want to shine a spotlight on them because we know that can help add some accountability and hold the elected officials there accountable for actions and doing what it's going to take to best represent their residents. But also, we're just rooting for them. They're our neighbors, and we want to see them win.
Another one of our neighbors is Hamtramck, another city that is carved out of Detroit.
Yeah.
Why cover Highland Park and not Hamtramck?
Right, and people ask us this all the time. A lot of people want us to cover Hamtramck, but listen, it's easy to group them together, right? Because they're these two municipalities right next to each other that are both completely engulfed in Detroit. They exist within the city of Detroit. They're surrounded, but they are in fact very, very different from one another. We talked about Highland Park being a majority black city. Hamtramck is a majority white city. Hamtramck is about 2/3 the size in area of Highland Park, but they have more than 3 times as many people. So, per square mile, Detroit's got about 4,000 people. Highland Park only has 3,000 people. Hamtramck's got 13,000 people per square mile. So that means their tax base is better. They're bringing in more revenues. They can more easily afford to support the infrastructure of their city and their residents. And so for that and just a ton of other reasons, they're very different cities. But also, Hamtramck already gets a lot of exposure in the media, and Highland Park does not. You can find stories in international media and newsrooms on the other side of the planet that are talking about Hamtramck. Highland Park, we feel like could probably get more coverage right here at home, and so we're trying to do that.
Sherrie, to bring you into the conversation, you've been covering Highland Park, attending city council meetings How does state oversight impact the city council and their decision making?
Well, it's definitely a theme that's addressed a lot at Highland Park City Council meetings. I've heard the president even speak about the fact that they don't want the city to lose their charter. It even came up in this last meeting this week about state oversight and some of the requirements that causes them to have. So I think that's definitely a constant cloud over Highland Park City Council, that's one of those things that they have to constantly keep in mind.
Sherrie, what issues do you think are most important to Highland Park residents?
So the last meetings that I've covered, definitely there's been a lot of talk about things like being able to purchase property in Highland Park, whether they be vacant lots near properties that people already own, for some of the churches and local businesses as well as residents, and just how that process, whether it's the timeliness of the process, as well as how the eligibility and requirements are being applied across different applicants, that's been a real concern, as well as the bond with their treasurer. The treasurer situation has been going on over a year at least. And the bond is a constant thing that is addressed at almost every meeting that I've attended since September. So I know that is a big one. And then things like cost and water, of course. Water in Highland Park has been a huge concern, whether it's everything from their GLEWA agreements to the master meters that are getting put in. There's usually at least a few questions from the public comment section about water.
Noah, what's the specific issue with the treasurer in Highland Park?
A treasurer of a city, they're the person that you're basically turning over the bank accounts to them. And the city and the municipality, what they want is some level of insurance that if this person, goes on to do something fraudulent or participate in any kind of malfeasance, they want an insurance policy that the city's coffers and the residents aren't going to suffer because of the actions of this one person or several people in that office. So the way they do that is they get bonded, and that's like basically insurance that protects them from that very thing if someone runs amok with the city's funds. They have a new treasurer. The last treasurer resigned. It was very controversial and involved a house that was purchased with state money that shouldn't have been, and then money that she owed back to the city, right? So there's already an issue of some malfeasance in this department, which is why the bond issue is so contentious. I believe in the past, the treasurer had about a $2 million bond was required. This time around with the new treasurer, Lisa Stolarski, they've asked for a $5 million bond, and Stolarski was unable to get that bonded to that level. So now the city council has agreed that they're going to try to help her get bonded to that level, but it seemed like at this last meeting there's some confusion about who's doing what, because city council asked Stolarski, well, have you applied for this bond? And she said, no, you're supposed to be helping me apply for this bond, and none of that has happened yet. So I think there's honestly just like a lot of confusion at this point, but at least for the first time we are kind of seeing an agreement for everyone to work together to solve this issue, because the specific problem here, to put it in a nutshell, is that she is the treasurer, she's in charge of the money, but she is not on the bank accounts, and she can't sign the checks until she gets this bond. And so that was actually what they voted on. They were considering putting her on the account and letting her sign the checks even without the bond. And, that was where we heard some of the more colorful disagreements at this most recent meeting.
You're listening to The Metro, and we're talking to Detroit documenter Sherrie Smith and coordinator Noah Kincade about Highland Park City Council. Noah, one of the interesting things about many councils is a parliamentarian. What is a parliamentarian, and how does it fit into Highland Park City Council?
Yeah, a parliamentarian, they serve a really important function, and we see it play out all the time in different bodies we cover at the Detroit Board of Police Commissioners and at Detroit City Council. They both have parliamentarians. Their job is to basically keep the meeting on track and following the order of procedures that should happen at that meeting. It's called parliamentary procedure, right? And there are several different standards you can follow. The most common is Robert's Rules of Order. which is a book that is constantly kind of getting revised. It's been around for a long time. Robert is no longer with us, but the interesting thing with Highland Park is that we started reporting on them in February of 2023, and it was the first meeting of this group of council members. And at that meeting, I think it was their very first vote. One of the very first matters they addressed was whether or not to hire a parliamentarian, and they chose not to. And we, in the 2 years that have followed, we've watched them argue amongst themselves over do we need a motion here? Is this a roll call vote? Do we need a simple majority on this? But what happens when one of us isn't here? Just argue about these matters that if they had a parliamentarian, those answers would just get, those questions would get quickly answered and they could move on.
Sherrie, can you introduce us a little bit to Highland Park's City Council? What is unique about the City Council?
So I'll do my best. Highland Park City Council has 5 members, 3 of them that represent their districts, and then they have 2 at-large members. I think what makes them unique that we've discussed before is that many of them are new to politics. They are also a part-time city council, so many of them have other work that they do to support themselves in doing this work. So first and foremost, I think they're a brave group of folks who are taking on such a daunting task with the state oversight, with the amount of work and love that Highland Park needs. We were just talking about the parliamentarian not being there, and I often think when they're in their meetings how their president kind of serves as the is looking up parliamentary things and kind of serves as the conflict resolver in the meetings. Yeah. And as I was looking into him on his LinkedIn, it said he had experience as a mediator, which it makes sense in the role that he plays a lot of times. They're a pretty passionate group. They have a lot of spirited debates. And I think that by and large, they are neighbors and residents. I think when I think of them, I think of people who are the everyday neighbors that people in Highland Park wanted to see in those roles, obviously. These are the people they're seeing every day, and they think that they can represent them. So I think that's phenomenal.
The city being so small and having kind of that more of a direct connection to your city council member, what kind of impact do you think that is having?
I think it's one of those things that there's less of a veil between residents and government. I think when you can, in a city as small as Highland Park, it's not a lot of places you're going to go. That there's not the giant KMAC in downtown Detroit where you can't get to somebody's office or you don't know where they're going to be. This is a much smaller place. It's easy to see somebody, right up the block or going to find out where people are. And so I think that not having that separation makes it a lot easier to make your desires as a resident known to council members, but it also makes it easier for council members to reach more of their constituents because it's a smaller area, it's a smaller number of people. So I think it's a lot easier to maintain that connection where the council member doesn't become as removed.
What things come up with city council being so small, having just 5 members? We've
seen this in the last meeting. There were only 4 members that were present, and so there were a few items that were, 2 people said yes, 2 people said no, so nope. And then that's just it. After spending over an hour in discussion and multiple meetings talking about an item, now because there's not a 5th person there, this item just drops. And so I think things like that can be tough because it's a small group and you can't really afford for people not to be there, but people can't always be there.
Sherrie, what do you think Detroit City Council might be able to learn from Highland Park City Council?
Well, I think there's definitely like I just talked about, the closeness with residents. I think it's easier in Detroit to kind of have pockets of supporters and just kind of focus on them, and that can sometimes be enough because in your district that might be just enough to get you the votes you need, and you may not have to focus on as much of the overall population of the city. So I think that breaking down some of those separations and getting connected to more constituents is important. I also think making sure that things are spoken plainly. One thing I definitely compliment the Highland Park City Council on is being clear and plain in their language, sometimes really colorful, but very, very clear and plain. And I think their residents appreciate that there's not a desire to impress other politicians. You know, they don't come across as if their political career is the most important thing to them. It definitely seems like their political life and behavior is personal because this is where they live. This is home to them as well.
That was producer Jack Filbrandt speaking with Detroit documenter Sherrie Smith and coordinator Noah Kincade. Assistant producer Lauren Myers and Trevor McConico contributed to this segment. The next Highland Park City Council meeting is March 4th.
From the WDET newsroom, a 6-5 Windsor City Council vote to continue a bus route under the Detroit River will not be enough to save the service. That's because Windsor Mayor Drew Dilkins vetoed funding for the bus route. He said it didn't make sense to continue operating the service amid the threat of North American tariffs, despite the majority of City Council being in favor of keeping the service. Coming up at 11, it's time to play ball with the Tigers. Our favorite baseball team just began spring training, so we're taking a look at the Tigers' upcoming season, and we want to know, what do the Tigers mean to you? Hit a grand slam by calling us at 313-577-1019.
And up next, Renaissance High School in Detroit swept the Public School League basketball championships earlier this month. We'll hear from one of the girls' basketball coaches and about the win, the importance of highlighting girls and women in sports, and the importance of teamwork in sports. We'll be back right here on the Metro. Stay right there.